Hey everybody, Phil here. Today we're going to do another episode of Phil vs. Solver. I got a hand sent in here by Danny, and we are going to look at the way he played it. We're going to look at this spot that he found himself in on the river. We're going to talk about what the solver would do, what I would do, what Danny did, and how it turned out. And Danny also has a question for me that actually reveals a little bit of his thought process and where I think I can actually help him outside of just how the individual hand is played. And hopefully some of you find that helpful as well. Let's get into the action. So the way the hand plays out, Danny is in the small blind, button opens to $5 at 1-2, so that's 2.5x. Danny 3-bets to $21, so that is 10.5x. And the button calls. Danny has king 10 of spades. Flop is king 9-7, 2 clubs, 1 heart. Danny checks. Button bets half pot, basically half pot. Once you take out rake, Danny check calls. Turn ace of spades. Danny checks, button checks. River 5 of clubs, bringing a flush. Danny decides to check. Button bets $49 into 88, and Danny calls. So let's load up the solver. Let's see what it has to say about all these plays, and then I'll talk about where I might play a little bit differently. All right, so starting with the 3-bet, which is standard, we can move on to the flop. So flop of king 9-7, two-tone. Solver has us only checking 20% of the time and utilizing a lot of small bets. So like quarter pot bets. It's betting quarter pot 56% of the time and check 20% of the time. Betting big being like 2/3 pot, 23% of the time or so. Does that add up? I don't know. I rounded, so it should roughly add up. I think there are a couple ways to go about this. So I would simplify this strategy because I think in a spot where you're only checking 20%, I would probably simplify this strategy to do something like bet quarter pot with my full range and eliminate the big bets. Like you're going to see, as you look through the different hands in a solver, you're going to see that every individual hand mixes between a big bet and a small bet if it's betting. Every hand's going to bet at some frequency, given how often our range is betting. And so the EV of those plays are relatively similar. And I don't think there's much our opponent can do about a strategy where we're keeping our range together and just betting small with the full range. I would simplify this to just go, let's call it third pot, quarter pot or third pot with my full range on this flop. However, if you want to take the opposite strategy, another way to simplify this is to not small bet at all and just bet big. So you're going with like betting 2/3, 3/4 pot, something like, we'll call it 40% of the time, and then checking 60. And if that's the case, I really like king 10 suited with no backdoors, no backdoor flush draw as a checking hand. This is not a good enough hand to bet big. Like you can, but this is the kind of hand that really forces out a lot of dominated hands when you bet big, and it works really well in a checking range. So depending on Danny's overall strategy here, I would either like to small bet everything or do a lot of big betting. And if we're doing a lot of big betting, I like this check. And actually king 10 specifically in the solver strategy, for what it's worth, is essentially never big betting. It gets in there like a tiny fraction of the time, but king 10 is basically always small betting. The primary big betting hands are like king queen and ace ace. And you'll generally find, looking at a solver and no limit, like a lot of the big bets in these lower SPR spots are going to come from really strong one pair hands. That's kind of just how it works. A lot of people intuitively think like, I want to use my biggest hands for my biggest bets. But when you have king king, when you have 9-9, you really don't want to force out hands that are drawing completely dead. You want to let them hit a pair or let them hit 2 pair, things like that. So once we check and the button bets half pot, which is actually a sizing it's using, reasonably often we have a very clear call with king 10. There's really no other play. We can actually see the solver mix in 4% raises, but we can ignore that. So all in all, good check call on the flop by Danny, and it kind of just depends, what he wants to do with his range in this spot. Turn ace, if you're curious whether or not the small blind is going to have any leads, the small blind is not going to have any leads. It's just continuing to check full range here. And actually against half pot, it's important to keep in mind that we were going to have to fold like a lot of ace queen, ace jack type hands. So the ace doesn't hit us as hard as you might think, I guess. In position is actually doing a lot of small betting, which is a little bit interesting, including like king queen. So leveraging that top pair, good kicker advantage. And obviously it has some top pair as well, or sorry, flop top pair. It also has some turn top pair with ace X, and it has some Two pair and sets from the flop, of course, but in this case, it went check, check. And the river's the 5 of clubs. There's not too much to talk about with king 10 on this river. It's just a very clear check. On this run out, the board's gotten very dicey. We're behind our opponent's flop value range. Some of our opponent's flop bluffs have turned an ace, and then some of our opponent's flop bluffs have river to a flush or straight maybe, or two pair for that matter. For the most part, our opponent is repping a lot of king X. To play this way, but still, like, king 10 is too thin. Our opponent shouldn't have a lot of like 7x and 9x. I mean, they'll be in there a little bit, but not very much. So I think very clear check. And when we face a 60% or so pot bet, the solver wants to mix. So basically, it's mostly folding. It's folding this hand 90% of the time or so, calling 10%. In a scenario where we had king 10 with a club, which we don't here, it's always calling, occasionally bluff raising, but mostly calling. But let's take a look at button strategy and what it is choosing to bet 60% pot with. So there's actually a lot of ace jack, ace 5 suited, ace queen off, ace jack off. So actually, like, a big portion of imposition's value range is going to come from top pair, and I don't feel like people bluff as many ace highs on this flop against a check as the solver is opting to do. So like the solver is going to have top pair almost 20% of the time. That seems too high as far as humans are concerned. And then the other thing is sets. So solver has 2% ace ace that slow played pre-flop, bet flop, and then slow played turn. I'm going to eliminate that too. And then there are flushes, of course. So there are definitely flushes that will play this way. I mean, kind of the obvious ones like ace jack suited, ace 10 suited, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited. Like ace 8 suited. And those I think are in there. So the solver is only bluffing a fraction of the time with unpaired hands by this river. So like if the solver got here with queen 10 of hearts or queen 10 of diamonds or queen 10 of spades, it's never bluffing river. If it got here with queen jack, it is bluffing river. Now, I guess that has to do with the jack being a better blocker than the 10. But I think those hands are roughly equivalent. And then jack 10 suited is essentially never bluffing river. So the solver actually gets here with an unpaired hand like 20% of the time, but it's only bluffing a small fraction of it. I think it's reasonably likely that people would bet flop, like humans would bet flop with queen 10, queen jack, jack 10, and then check turn a decent amount of the time if they don't have a flush draw, or with a flush draw, but check turn, and then decide to bluff river because something got there. Solver's also bluffing if it got here with like 6-5, which is going to be pretty rare. Not betting any king X. So basically, here's how I feel. I think this is probably a good call because I think that our human opponent is not going to have as many ace X hands as the solver does here. And I also think our human opponent is more likely to overbluff than underbluff the like queen jack, queen 10, jack 10 hands that it gets here with. The big wild card here is if our opponent is value betting king queen and considering value betting king jack, then they have so many value hands that this hand becomes a fold, even though we block those hands with our king. So I think the two major factors to consider are how often our opponent's playing ace X this way and how often they're playing king queen or king jack this way. I'm going to be willing to bet that they're not playing ace X this way as often as they should, and that they are correctly checking back a hand like king queen and king jack here, correctly according to theory. So I'm going to go with call. I'm going to go with I like Danny's river call. So disagree for the most part with the solver, which seems to usually happen. And let's go find out who was right. All right, so pulled up the hand. Drum roll, please. Danny's opponent had jack 8 of hearts. So flop got shot, backdoor flush draw, air on the river, and Danny and I made a good hero call. That's 1 point me, 1 point Danny, 0 points solver. One thing to note is that actually the solver doesn't have jack 8 suited here, but Danny's opponent is not incorrect. I was using a sim with a larger 3-bet sizing than Danny was using. So Danny made a smaller raise, which would allow his opponent to call more jack 8 or to call jack 8, which the solver wasn't. So actually jack 8 wasn't a bluff that was in there, but it's in there in the human range and also in the solver range if I use the exact sizings here, which I did not. The fact that more of those hands are in there makes it more of a call, I believe. I mean, primarily, especially if we don't think our opponent's betting enough ace X on the flop. Because if more jack 8 suited is calling, more 8-6 suited is calling, etc., there are more that, well, 8-6 actually makes a straight, but more 10-6 suited, maybe perhaps 10-8 suited. More of those bluffs are potentially in there. And there will also be some weaker ace X hands in there. But if we stick with the assumption that our opponent's not going to bet a lot of those ace X hands, then it actually just gives our opponent more bluffs and fewer value combos. So I like the call even more given the pre-flop 3-bet sizing. Actually, when I was looking up the results, I realized that Danny asked whether or not I like a block bet on the river or a check call. And I guess the advice I would give, so we saw in the solver, basically don't have a block betting range here on this river because the way the hand is played out, essentially, I think you'd want to go for value with some like ace queen type hands if you have them, and those can go big because you're targeting like king X. But a block bet here with king 10 doesn't really make sense because you're kind of targeting like a 9x or 7x, which is not supposed to bet the flop very much. So I wouldn't block bet. And then I also, just based on that wording, I would say be careful of getting to a river and saying, okay, well, I have second pair, it's pretty good. Should I block bet or should I check call? Because what you should do is decide if it's good enough to block bet. In this case, it's not. If it's not, then you should check. And don't just assume you're check calling because you have a king. Like the king doesn't matter that much. And so what you should do is what I did in this video, break down the way you think your opponent is going to play different hands. And if you think they're going to end up over bluffing, then call with your king and also call with your 9 or your 7. But if you think they're going to be under bluffing, then fold your 9, fold your 7, fold your king, even if it's king queen. Definitely don't get tied to absolute hand strength in a spot where your opponent's representing a better hand than yours. I think that's a dangerous trap that a lot of people fall into. A hand is not good enough to check call unless it's beating value bets. If it's not beating value bets and it's not blocking a huge percentage of value bets, then it's just a bluff catcher. And it just comes down to how often your opponent's bluffing. It doesn't really matter what your cards are in that case. So hopefully that's helpful to Danny and to some of you. I'm glad that I won one against the solver. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care.